You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 3, Kidnapping, by R.A. Consul.
Chapter 21, Sticks and Stones. Sleeping in Niflheim prison was difficult by design. As it was intended to house wizards, no facilities were provided for comfort. Those housed within its salty walls could use the very weak magical field to warm themselves. Of course, whatever warmth was generated would seep away quickly should the inmate lose focus by falling asleep, so nights were restless at best. Arthur was better equipped than most for the trials of the jail. He grew a thick coat of fur to supplement his winter coat and what little magical heat he could generate. His efforts were soundly undermined by his cellmate, however, who could barely keep the water he'd been given to drink from freezing, and had a cold breeze whipping around him at all times. They spent the night huddled together for warmth. The pitch black of their cell was barely held back by a flickering conjured light. The sleep they eventually earned was fleeting and miserable. Kuro wasn't convinced that he'd managed to get any, except that a sound had woken him with a start. It was hard to judge time, but the pale light through the narrow window suggested it was just after dawn, and someone was moving through the corridor. They were coming slowly, unevenly. Perhaps they walked with a heavy limp, dragging one foot, or perhaps they were dragging a body. The noise stopped outside their door, and the lock rattled. It was morning, and Roche the warden had promised they would be released after Phineas carved anything inconvenient from their minds. Kuro tried and failed to steady his breathing, fighting back the panic welling up inside him at the thought of seeing his old master again. He felt Arthur squeeze his hand. He didn't know which one of them Arthur was attempting to comfort and didn't care. It helped, if only a little. The lock rattled again, followed by a soft thud, like a pillow being dropped. Tension and confusion grew as the clicking and jiggling of the lock resumed, like someone was gently trying every key on an oversized keychain and guessing wrong every time. At last, a solid click from the lock. Kuro clenched his jaw and wrestled back the instinct to throw himself at his master's feet. The door swung open slowly, pulled by the breeze, to reveal an empty hallway. On the floor outside their cell lay Kuro's book bag, several of Charlie's lockpicks, and a bright blue bowler hat. Peeking out from beneath the hat were two black, beady eyes. Autolycus? Kuro strained to keep himself from shouting. The raccoon warily lifted the hat and stumbled towards his creator. After dragging a bag through the prison while searching for the boys, he wasn't well. The salty environment was eating away at him. He was thinner and smaller. Chunks of fur were dissolving into the air, wisping away like black smoke. Kuro ran to pick up his familiar, as if holding him might somehow heal him. "You little idiot," he said. "You might have died." The raccoon gripped Kuro weakly and pressed his muzzle against his maker's chest. They were free. Kuro remembered the way out, and he was confident he could reach the side door and pick his way through. But past that, he didn't know what to do. They were trapped on an island and a continent away from help. He had seen Ms. Crawley's cell on his return trip from the warden. It was just around the next corner. Years of instinct took over as he crept, listened, and peeked. His partner, the West Wind, helped. She blew gently to let him listen, and more vigorously as he moved to mask the footfalls. Not that it was needed. Kuro's practiced steps could sneak up on a bat. So, too, apparently, could Arthur's. Startled by the lack of noise from his friend, Kuro took a quick look back to find he was looking in a mirror. "It's easier to do what you do when I am you," Arthur explained, taking the pause as an opportunity to roll up the cuffs on his pants. Kuro got to work on Ms. Crawley's door. The lock was frustratingly complicated. It was magic-proof, as many of the best wizard locks were. Anything intended to keep a wizard in or out needed to be immune from magical tampering. That was the reason Kuro was able to get past them. The simplest magical latch was an impenetrable barrier to him, but the finest in magic-resistant security fell beneath Pix and Patience. He had the former, but not so much of the latter at that moment. "Who's there?" asked Ms. Crawley, sounding as though the clattering in her door had roused her from sleep. "Quiet, please," said Kuro. "We're escaping and could really use your help." The response was near silence, but Kuro thought he heard her chuckling to herself. The lock had too many tumblers and false gates galore, but he was making steady progress. That is, until he heard another voice echo down the halls. "Wake up, Kuro. We have an appointment." It was sneering and bitter, and clearly eager to enact cruelty. Phineas Hearn. "Hurry up," said Arthur. Unfortunately, hurrying was not something that made lockpicking any faster. They were out of time. Kuro prepared to run, but was denied that option. "Why, you horrible little creature!" Phineas had arrived at their cell and found it empty. "If you can hear me, stop moving this instant. Stay absolutely still until I tell you otherwise." Kuro froze. Pick pressed against the last tumbler. The order was thorough, well considered, as if he'd spent the time since their last encounter reflecting on what had gone wrong. "You can fight him," encouraged Arthur. "You beat him before." He had. But Phineas had been exhausted, distracted, and surprised. Kuro had used a spell he hadn't even attempted since, and doing so had nearly killed him. He couldn't fight the man this time. "Come here, Kuro," Phineas ordered. "Without speaking, arms at your sides." Kuro started to comply, but Arthur stopped him. "He's not talking to you," he said. "I'm the Kuro he's talking to." It was brilliant and incredibly foolish. Out of the corner of his eye, Kuro watched his duplicate walk slowly, obediently, down and around the corner. "Stop right there, that's close enough," Phineas snarled. "Stay still until I tell you to move." Arthur had bought Kuro time, but hadn't released him from his statuesque state. He raced to find a way around it. He tried to convince himself that the original order had been for Arthur, but his instincts rebelled. He could believe Phineas was now talking to the Kuro copy, but could not make himself move. "Where is your friend?" demanded Phineas. "Tell me." "He shrank and slipped through the window," said Arthur in a startlingly good impersonation of Kuro. "He's a changeling. Went to find his father." Phineas swore. "We'll need to send the warden's pet hound after him. It would be troublesome if he drowned in the ocean trying to escape." Kuro stared at the lock, willing his fingers to make the last few motions, but just thinking it made his chest heavy. He could disobey, but he couldn't maintain the delicate touch needed for this work if he did. "Well, I still have you, don't I?" Phineas said. "I have some frustrations to work out, and I don't need to be as delicate with you as I was with his little princess." There was a tug at Kuro's trousers, and another. He felt Autolycus weakly climb him, up his leg and over his shoulder. "Our good warden wants me to remove your memories of this place, but he's not here, is he? He wouldn't deign to come down from his little sanctuary. So you won't remember much, but you will remember this." Autolycus clambered up Kuro's arm and took hold of his hands. Placing an ear to the door, the raccoon began to gently push at the lockpick. Drowning out the sound of his work, Ms. Crawley shouted through the door, "Don't you touch that child, Hearn!" He laughed, the cruel, joyless laugh that haunted Kuro's nightmares. "Or what, Beatrice? Are you going to shout your way out of your cell? You can have the joy of listening. Kuro, make sure she can hear you clearly." "I don't think I will," said Arthur. There was a brief silence as Phineas's rage replaced his callous confidence. "You will pay for your insolence," he screeched, and then, "I told you to stay still. Stop moving." "No, thank you," said Arthur. "Obey me!" Phineas's fury echoed through the empty halls of Niflheim as Autolycus maneuvered the last tumbler into place and spun the lock. "No," said Arthur. expressing an anger Kuro had never heard from his friend and had never been able to achieve for himself. "Never again! I don't belong to you!" Then, in a horrified tone Kuro had not heard from his former master, "What in all the hells are you?" The door to Ms. Crawley's cell blew open. She was there, though not as Kuro remembered her. Her round glasses were bent and cracked, and threadbare coveralls hung on her diminished frame. The soft edges that made her so much look like an owl had been chiseled away by darkness and poor food, leaving her looking hawkish. She moved more like a hawk, too, sweeping past Kuro with predatory grace. The wind went with her. There were no words spoken. Kuro was left frozen, arms outstretched, supporting an unwell raccoon, while around the corner, violence erupted. With the magic so thin, there was no chanting or flashes of fire and lightning. Only the sounds of brutal, graceless brawling, muddied by a hurricane-force wind. Fists slammed into flesh with muted thuds. Snarls of pain accompanied the tearing of fabric. Grunts of effort were punctuated by the splintering of wood and shouts from Lucy demanding to know what was happening. The wind faded, and the hall went quiet except for the sound of exhausted panting. Then, as the morning had started, there was the sound of something being dragged along the stone floor. Ms. Crawley, limping, her bent glasses now broken, hauled Phineas around the corner. He was weakly resisting, but appeared terrified of Arthur, who had returned to his habitual form and followed close behind, menacing Hearn with the broken halves of his walking stick. He was shoved unceremoniously at Kuro's feet. Rolling to a less painful position, he glared up at Kuro with the one eye that was not swelling shut. There was anger left in him, but not enough to fight back the pain. His nose was broken, as were likely multiple ribs, given his labored breathing. He appeared, also, to have been mauled by a wild animal, with blood seeping into tears in his formerly dapper suit. "Tell him exactly what I tell you," instructed Ms. Crawley, "and remember the primary thing keeping you alive is that I don't want to murder you in front of the children." Phineas hadn't the courage to even sneer back at her. Word for word, he repeated after Ms. Crawley. "Kuro, you no longer have to follow my orders. You may stop following any order I have ever given you if you so choose." It seemed Phineas wasn't the only one who had been reflecting on their battle in Detritus Lane. The instruction was short, simple, and well considered. Kuro hadn't been told to stop following old orders, which may well have been fatal, as some of his instructions revolved around his own survival. Neither was it a clumsy instruction to forget them, however, which may have left him following the old commands without knowing why. Over a decade's worth of overlapping obligations released their grip on him. He could talk to people, go to forbidden places, say how he felt about his former master, share things he'd kept secret. The constant impulse he felt every time he encountered a beverage, to steal it and bring it to his former master, an order sitting unfulfilled since the day Phineas had been arrested, vanished like smoke. He looked Ms. Crawley dead in the eye and said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me too soon," she said as she shoved Phineas into her cell. "We haven't escaped yet. Hearn, give me your keys." "I already have them," said Kuro, producing a ring with a dozen old and worn keys dangling from it. "When did you get those?" asked Ms. Crawley in shock. "Just now," said Kuro. "It's much faster when I don't need to write a note." A fleeting look of worry betrayed Ms. Crawley's uncertainty as to whether unshackling Kuro from Phineas was entirely wise. It was not, however, the right time to worry about his criminal potential. She took the keys, locked Phineas in her old cell, and ran to release Marie's mother. "Hey, Lucy, or whoever you really are, we're escaping. Did you want to come?" "You're bloody what?" replied the woman, claiming to be Marie's mother. "To right I'd like to come?" In all the stories, escaping from Niflheim was nearly impossible. One would need years of planning, careful timing, and extraordinary strength and skill. One would need to overcome an army of guards, evade alarms, dogs, and watchbirds, and finally scale the towering walls with nothing but the back half of a spoon. The stories never involved a group of prisoners simply walking out the side door using a borrowed set of keys. Of course, those tales were meant to frighten and entertain. Also, they didn't consider a collection of folks being kept separate from the guards and other inmates as a result of the warden's secret machinations. Those stories also tended to end after the prisoners made it over the wall. They imagined freedom to be certain once that barrier had been crossed. Escaping wizards would just conjure a boat and paddle out into the Blandlands and to safety. That was a fine story, but failed to imagine just how big, cold, and violent the ocean could be. As the door latched behind them, the group of escapees were faced with a brutal storm raging beyond the veil. Vicious waves, which could swallow a boat whole, bent and twisted the veil as they crashed against the shore. "This does not look much like an escape," observed Marie's mother. "Perhaps not," replied Miss Crawley, "but I've had ample time to imagine what I'd do should I ever find myself in this situation." She walked towards the cliff, stretching as if preparing for acrobatics and humming scales of notes to warm up her voice for spellcasting. As she moved farther from the damping effects of the prison, she seemed to come alive with power. Her movements became fluid and purposeful, and the humming turned to a melody of magic. Ice and snow gathered around her and danced at her command. Before her, it gathered, melted, and refroze into a glistening structure of solid ice. Glassy smooth, a sweeping ramp formed, which descended to the dock against which the small ferry was moored. She presented the slide with a hint of pride. "After you," she offered. It seemed improper to enjoy fleeing from a fortress of misery in exactly that manner, but Kuro couldn't restrain a fit of giggles as he slid at irresponsible speeds down to the dock. He barely had time to move out of the way before Arthur came sliding in behind, followed by Marie's mother. Ms. Crawley came last, with her slide bursting into a glistening cascade of snow behind her. As soon as her feet were beneath her, she began casting again. Her movements were precise and intricate. The melody was as beautiful as it was complex, blending several languages into a song that carried layered and interwoven meanings. What she was enacting was an act of spellcraft so far beyond what they had learned in school, it was difficult to even contemplate. The effect was to transform the small ferry, built for calmer seas and skilled pilots, into a hulking brute of a vessel that could confidently carve across the waves. The hull thickened and stretched in length and breadth. Low walls rose and enclosed to shelter passengers from the storm, and the Blandlands engine was duplicated and enlarged. What she had created was by no means a work of art, but it was big, sturdy, and ready to withstand whatever the ocean could throw at it. What it could not withstand being thrown at it, however, was a very large rock. Hurled from near the prison gates, a jagged boulder smashed through their escape vessel, cleaving it in two. One half sank in moments, while the other washed out to sea, passing through the veil and out of reach of magic before Ms. Crawley could do anything to stop it. Given enough time, perhaps she would have had the skill to raise and rebuild the ship, but the one who hurled the boulder wasn't going to give her that opportunity. Joseph was taking his guard duty seriously. The young hound didn't have the elegant touch of Ms. Crawley, but a pair of conjured skis were speeding his descent down the winding path to the docks, and the rod in his hand, crackling with electric charge, communicated his intentions clearly. "Get in my bag," Kuro said. He could get them off the island. He could cross the span of salt water in a single step as he had on Avalon. The women ignored him, choosing instead to stand against the hound. They didn't understand what he could do. Even if they did, they may have chosen to stay and fight anyway. The odds of Kuro succeeding weren't good even when he was calm and well prepared. Should he fail here, the rough seas would be even less forgiving, and he doubted much effort would be made to fish them out. Arthur, though, did know what Kuro could do, and did not believe in the abilities of a schoolteacher and a stray to battle a hound, even a rookie. He snatched Kuro's bag and shoved it down over Ms. Crawley's head from behind. "Please get in," he said to Marie's mother, ignoring the vocal protests of his former teacher from within the satchel. She looked between the two boys with suspicion, and then at the rapidly approaching hound. She wasn't prepared to battle him alone, and took the confidence in Arthur's eyes as some kind of assurance. "This had better be a good plan," she said, and dove into the bag with a level of confidence one wouldn't expect from a Blandlander. "It is a good plan," said Arthur, as he climbed in himself. Kuro wasn't so sure. Most likely, he was about to plunge them all into a freezing ocean. It would probably be better just to surrender. let Phineas clean out the brains, and allow Roche to keep the adults prisoner. At least then they'd all survive. "You can do it," said Arthur, before pulling the flap of the bag over his head and dropping down inside. There was something about the utterly flat delivery that made it seem true. It was a statement of fact rather than opinion, almost convincing enough to make Kuro believe it. He ran towards the end of the pier, eyes closed, trying to forget the situation he was in and the roaring surf he was probably about to drown in. "Wait!" shouted Seth, having moved close enough to be audible. "It's dangerous!" That concerned-sounding warning pulled Kuro's mind into the moment and quashed any hope he had of skipping over the ocean. He skidded to a halt, opening his eyes to see the shimmering fabric that separated the fairy realm from the Blandlands mere feet in front of him. He turned to find Seth running towards him, a look of genuine worry on his face, which was undermined by the charged lightning rod in his hand. The escape had failed, and now Kuro had to wonder whether he would survive the surrender. He could imagine the ensorcelled hound gently apologizing for the inconvenience of their being electrocuted and tossed in the ocean. With the anchor on, Kuro could not hope to outrun his attacker, although that did not stop the west wind from urging him to try. The inability to move him enraged her, and she blasted at him from behind with all her fury. While the bracelet kept her from touching Kuro, she all but tore his clothes from him. He clung to his satchel full of fellow escapees, and fought to stay balanced as the dock beneath him started to groan under her assault. Seth struggled to advance against the onslaught, though he did press forward. His run had slowed to a labored trudge, but through a combination of magic and dogged determination, he was still advancing. Under calmer circumstances, Kuro might have recalled that the West Wind was not trapped in the fairy realm. They had first met out in the Blandlands. While she was limited in strength and freedom out there, she could still blow hard enough to help Kuro outrun a grown man. That, though, was in the eastern cities, and she was the West Wind. Here, out on the open ocean beyond the western shores of the continent, this was her home, her seat of power. The storm raging in the sea was merely a sign of her upset at her chosen partner being imprisoned and her inability to help him. Kuro was not well situated to consider the nature of his gaseous companion at that moment, however, as he was too busy trying to imagine a path forward that did not include him being drowned, electrocuted, or quite possibly both. That distraction provided an opportunity he did not recognize until the pier beneath him vanished and he started to fall. While Kuro had stopped at the edge of the veil had no obligation to stay still, and the wind had encouraged it not to. A huge swell had crashed against the island, and the salt water pushed the veil farther inland, washing over the dock. The only warning that it was coming had been the look of sudden panic from Seth, which only distracted Kuro further as the veil swept over him. Not knowing it was coming meant that he didn't know he was supposed to be crossing it. That simple piece of ignorance meant that as the threshold between worlds passed over him, he didn't pass through it. He stayed in the fairy realm. The transition was disorienting. The sound of the storm raging behind him switched direction in an instant, and his view of an approaching hound with a backdrop of Niflheim Prison vanished, replaced with the fabric of the veil shimmering between him and the raging ocean. Unfortunately, the dock on that side of the crossing had not been built to align with the one on Niflheim Island. That wasn't a concern for wizards who couldn't skip over the salt water the way Luton and Kuro could. Consequently, Kuro found nothing between him and the waves into which he plunged helplessly. He did not know how to swim. Falling into an icy cold harbor at the edge of the ocean was not the best circumstances in which to learn. He barely had the wherewithal to hold his breath before he found himself under the water and being swept away by the current. The cold was intense, shooting through him, stiffening his limbs, and crippling him with pain and instant exhaustion. His pathetic attempts to swim were barely enough to get his head above the waves for a fleeting breath before he was swept out into the raging surf of the Blandlands. The Blandlands rejected him almost upon entry. He was lifted and tossed by the waves back through the thin veil of the harbor, whose currents pulled him under once again, in what was fast becoming a cycle that could only end with his cold and wet demise. By the second trip, he couldn't even force himself to the surface, and could catch only the briefest of breaths as the stormy Blandland seas churned him to the surface. Even the fear for his life could not fight off the darkness that the cold and lack of air was inflicting on him. He grew weaker by the second, which meant he was unable to fight the tug on his collar when he felt himself being pulled. Dragged free of the water, he coughed and sputtered, trying to force air back into his lungs before he'd removed all of the water. At his side was a fishman, a creature with webbed hands and feet, scaled fins and gills, though he was rapidly changing shape to take on a much more Arthur-like appearance. "I told you you could do it," he said.
Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.